Hi again guys, and welcome back to Special Projects, but today we have got something a little bit different. Usually in Special Projects we of course do replica builds, but on this particular occasion, as with some occasions before, we're making, instead of a replica, a vehicle which could happen rather than has happened. A custom build based on the kind of specs and visuals that you could imagine a car having were it an existing model of a range. And basically with this particular build, what I've done is I've taken the concept of the ultimate performance Range Rover, the Range Rover Sport SVR, and then applied that concept to the Evoque. What could a Range Rover Evoque SVR be like? I've tried to keep it realistic, as always. Obviously you don't want to have like 900 horsepower, even if you could do that, and have ridiculously low weight. You've got to keep it relatively realistic, but also obviously have an increase in visuals, performance, etc. to make it appropriate to that model, were it on the game, were it a real car, etc. Now for this particular model, there's no real need to go over to the visual tuning garage, because as you can see, I've left the rims stock. For two reasons. One, that's more authentic for a production vehicle, and two, because I think they look pretty good anyway. And as far as the bodywork on the vehicle, I've gone for the Type 3 or Type C body kit, which is the biggest and beefiest body kit, which has a kind of dark carbon look to it, which actually looks really appropriate to an SVR style vehicle. I've left the rear lip wing on the boot lid stock. And as far as the colour, if you would like to use the same colour that I've gone for, it's called Arden Blue Pearl, and that actually comes from at least the Vauxhall Tigra. I'm not sure if it's available on any other cars, but you can definitely get it from the Tigra. I think probably from both the Vauxhall and Opel dealerships. I personally think it's a great looking blue. It suits the car, I think, and overall, as far as the visuals, I'm actually really happy with how this car turned out. To me, it looks authentic. It looks convincing as to what an SVR model could look like. But of course, just as important as the looks is how it performs. So we'll now go over to the mechanical garage for the performance side of things. Now, as always, of course, I do like to round these off, if at all possible, PP-wise, and when you're building a custom tune, it is always easier to do that because you don't have to fit in with certain weight and power parameters, so there is more room to breathe. As you can see, it's got a pretty high PP, 510, and I've tried to give it specs which feel authentic, as I said, to what it could be like were this a real vehicle, but at the same time you don't want it to be on par with the specs of the actual Range Rover SVR, because that would just defeat the purpose of having the lower model. So we've increased the performance and the spec, but we haven't gone crazy with it. So I've gone for sport soft tyres. I've left the brakes stock for the same reason that we've got it on sports tyres, and that is to make it feel like an authentic production road-going vehicle. For the suspension, I've got the ride height on 180 front and rear, which probably sounds really high, but it doesn't look that high at all, as you saw just now. Springs we've rounded off to 650 and 5. The dampers and anti-roll I've left on 3, because although, yes, it is a higher performance model, you don't want it to feel too good. It does need to have a little bit of softness and a little bit of body roll, which is appropriate to, again, a production road vehicle. I've left the camber and toe stock. As far as the gearbox, again, I've opted to leave it stock. You could change the ratios, and by all means do so if you feel like it, but I've, for two reasons, left that stock. One is because I like the way the stock gearboxes change gear. I always use an auto gearbox because I'm lazy, and the gear changes of the stock gearboxes are usually smoother than an upgraded one. And the second reason is because when you upgrade to a race gearbox, you actually get what they call straight cut gears. And without going too in-depth and taking up too much time, basically the reason why you go to straight cut gears is so that you can change gear quicker. The downside is it makes the gearbox produce a supercharger-esque whine. And that's why rally cars, for instance, make a whining noise, because of the straight cut gears, and that's also why when you put a car into reverse gear, it makes that whining noise, because that gear set is straight cut. Now, when you do that, it makes the car whine. That's not how a production car sounds, so I've opted to leave that stock, even though sometimes we do change that on replicas. The main reason why I do sometimes change that despite the whining noise is because the ratios are just more important than that noise. In the case of this car though, we don't need to stick to any ratios because it's not real. So, as I said, feel free to upgrade it if you want, but I've opted not to. As far as the clutch, flywheel and prop shaft, I've left those stock. Again, it's a production car, you don't want it to feel too good. I've opted for a torque distribution of 50-50. It's an SUV, you want plenty of torque going to the front end as well. But again, feel free to change that around if you need to. For the diff, as you can see, we've gone for the lowest initial torque, highest acceleration and braking to loosen up the steering. As far as power, you don't have to adhere to what I've done, of course, because it's not a real car, but I've opted to give it, as you can see, 470 horsepower. And the way that I've done that is with a Stage 3 engine tune, sports computer, manifold, cat, high range turbo and intake tuning, plus an oil change, and then reduce the power down to 93.1%. And as far as the weight, we've reduced it a little bit with the Stage 1 weight loss, and then added a 121 kilo ballast, which I've put all the way to the rear of the car to both give it a reduced but at the same time realistic weight, but also improving the distribution. So overall, that's it for my personal imaginary spec of what the SVR version of an Evoque could be like. But now, to see what it's actually capable of, let's of course take it out to a track. Now the rear end in particular on this car under heavy acceleration does lower towards the ground. It's got a little bit of that trademark SUV sag, if you will. But I personally like that. It makes it look more like an authentic street vehicle. In real life, real production road cars, even high performance ones, especially bigger, larger, heavier ones, do tend to buck and sway under acceleration and cornering, so that's appropriate, it's realistic, that's how it should look and feel. But overall, as far as how this car performs, I'm really happy with it. I love the way this car handles. It's extremely fun to drive, and even though it is an SUV, it's not an overly large or overly heavy one, so it's fun to drive and it's certainly quick. Now, this isn't built for racing, but if you do build it for racing and use it for racing, obviously I hope you find it fun for that. And if you'd like to keep up with other builds like this in the future, be sure to hit subscribe down below for that. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.